tonight.
Excuse me, Amy. Thank you. Okay, recording.
Okay. I am Amy Sherwood, a member of the League of Women Voters of Colorado's Legislative Action Committee and of the Arapahoe Douglas chapter hosting this evening, along with the Climate Emergency Task Force. This meeting is being recorded and all mics have been turned off. However, feel free to use the chat for questions that we will try and address at the end with any time allowed. Our guest this evening, Mr. Justin Nobel, will present a PowerPoint to explain the material that he has spent 7 years researching and shares beautifully in his book, Petroleum 238, Big Oil's Dangerous Secret and the Grassroots Fight to Stop It. Here's a summary of his background. Justin Nobel graduated from Columbia University with a master's in journalism and a master's of arts in earth and environmental science degrees. He also earned a Bachelor of Science degree in earth and ocean science from Duke University. Justin is a freelance journalist reporting on oil and gas development across the United States and has written Petroleum 238. His 2020 Rolling Stone magazine story, America's Radioactive Secret, won the National Association of Science Writers Award that inspired his book. His writing has been taught at the Harvard School of Public Health. Justin has reported from Nunavut in the Canadian Arctic, California, Florida, New Orleans, and the Gulf Coast for the publications Oxford America, Orion, Nautilus. And for Audubon, he wrote science stories, fact-checked, and blogged. Justin has received a reporting grant from the Investigation Fund at the Nation Institute McGraw Center for Business Journalism at City University of New York. He has written stories and taken photos on science and culture with Time, Rolling Stone, Harper's Magazine, and other magazines and investigative sites. He launched a multimedia inauguration project featured in the New York Times. Our guest has also penned stories for the Canadian Arctic paper that included award-winning photos as well as photos for the Associated Press. He was a research assistant to Dr. Gabby Lasky, deploying instruments to measure underwater earthquakes associated with the Hawaii hotspots on the Scripps research vessel. He has surveyed endangered plants at the Mexican border region and has also been a research assistant in Peru and Bolivia in pursuit of paleoclimate data. For the Museum of Natural Science, as assistant science writer, he researched and drafted copy with featured science stories on their website. In Western Kenya, he surveyed birds in an agricultural village. Well, with all that said, we proudly wish to welcome tonight's guest speaker, science journalist and author, Mr. Justin Nobel. Good evening, Justin.
Good evening, Amy, and good evening, everyone. That was a really, really lovely introduction. Amy covered a lot of different aspects of my life, many I haven't thought about in a while, but all helped to get to this point where we are today. So yeah, thank you so much, and thank you, Barb, and thank you, League of Women Voters. Really one of the most special organizations, I think, across the country. It was one of the first groups I spoke to on this issue in Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania chapter. That was maybe 2018 when I was first beginning to uncover this topic. So it's great to reconnect with Colorado folks. And do you want me to go from here, or do you all want to say other things?
No, I think we've got it all set. You're all set to go. I think you're going to run your slides, correct?
Okay, great. Well, that is fine. Yeah. Just to focus for a moment on what you just laid out in the introduction. I mean, a couple of things apparent there, how many different types of publications I write for as a freelancer, that really is essential to have a lot of different types of contacts, and journalism and industry is an industry that changes, quickly, and magazines change and fall out of business, and the world changes. You have to really move with this craft we're doing, which is words, telling stories with words. It started more with science, as some of those jobs you described, those were really science jobs or science gigs or internships that I had. And now it's led more to an investigative type of journalism, though that's very much couched and based in science. None of this reporting would have really been possible without a really thorough background in science and understanding of how to read a scientific
Maybe he got
paper,
one for his birthday because it was open.
and how to do research, and how to then do what we have as a privilege as journalists, which is talk to the person who did the research, talk to scientists, and interview them. So this investigation really followed that pathway, and relied on it quite heavily, the pathway of science. And then the other pathway is spending time in oil and gas communities in areas of the country like Colorado, like Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, North Dakota, where there's really significant oil and gas development. And the pace, of course, if you've been in these areas for the past 10, 20 years, the pace has really been quite hectic and quite relentless. And that's where a lot of my reporting comes in, although it predates what I'm going to explain, predates fracking. These issues were around before them. So I will draw up the presentation. And just as you can see, a background now, I'm sure there's dresses hanging. I'm in a dress shop. My partner is a dressmaker, and has also been, has an amazing ability to see pattern, and has been super, super helpful in just supporting my ability to navigate this terrain. So the artistic collaboration goes around in many different concentric loops here. Okay, I'm going to share the screen.
We can see it, Justin, being shared.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you for commenting. Okay, super. So yeah, I mean, the first thing that I can mention here, and you see the artist behind this really cool cover design, and the photographer, but this is a real photo. This is a house in Louisiana that is right next to an oil refinery. A lot of people think this photo was photoshopped and grafted, the house put in front of the refinery. But no, in Louisiana and many other parts of the country, you actually have homes this close to infrastructure. And another lesson from this photo is that eventually what happened is this house was destroyed. These people living this close are typically going to be sick. They might die of cancer. Their children might get sick. They have to move, or they're too sick to really continue to battle the company, which is, and you can see the emissions right in this case coming out. It's not safe to live at that distance. And this is really what I've learned, what industry wants. They would rather buy people out, make them sick enough that they are just desperate to get the heck out of there, and then they can own the land. And really, I see this happening in parts of the country where you see the oil zone really eating into the communities and annoying people or sickening them to such an extent that they can just take over those houses, and then they don't have to worry about humans anymore. It's a really kind of cynical mode of operating, but I've seen it play out in a number of different oil fields. So this house is no longer, the refinery has now been able to stamp into that neighborhood. But for a while, you actually had a home that close there. So this is a really nice quote to start with, because I think when people hear about radioactivity and oil and gas, radioactivity is a very charged word, and people may think they know a lot about oil and gas, and that those two words don't go together. But we can read the quote here. Essentially, what you are doing is taking an underground radioactive reservoir and bringing it up to the biosphere, where it can interact with people and the environment. And so this is one thing. This is one version of thinking about oil and gas development. This is certainly happening too. I think a lot of people might think of the fuels of oil, which still runs much of the world, of gas, natural gas, which still powers many home stoves, that little blue flame. And now also people, of course, will think of climate change and emissions like carbon dioxide and methane, but this is happening as well. You're pulling materials up from deep within the earth, and bringing them to the surface, which is where we live as humans. And so when those materials are problematic, they pose problems at the surface, because again, that's where we're breathing and drinking and living out our lives. And Dr. Marco Kaltofen, really one of the phenomenal sources among many that has helped me understand these topics. This is just that's the index of the book. I won't go through all of it now, but the book really acts as a road trip that takes us across the oil and gas fields of America, which with a very interesting story in Colorado. But I will get to that in a bit. So this is a very simple diagram to again try and explain what's happening at an oil and gas well. On the left, we see what would be called a conventional well. That's just the type of oil and gas that we've been harnessing for many, many years. And on the right, we see what would be called an unconventional fracked well. And one important point here is that conventional wells, the type of oil and gas that's been happening for over 150 years in the United States commercially, what's happening there is drillers are accessing kind of like a bubble of fuel that has collected and been trapped against another geologic layer. And so when you drill down into that layer, the oil or the gas often comes up forcefully. If it's oil, you can imagine oil literally fountaining out at the surface, like happens in Hollywood movies, or you've seen maybe in, earlier times in oil fields in the US. That's the oil is at such pressure that when you drill into the reserve, it's fountaining out. And the gas would rush out in a room. It's really coming out at pressure. Now, modern fracking, involves drilling down into layers where the oil and gas is stuck much more tightly. It's not, if you drill down vertically into it and you reach the layer, it's not just going to rush out or gush out. It's stuck in those layers. And these layers are often referred to as tight shales or tight rock formations or black shales. Black shales really are the mother lode for most of the oil and gas in the world. And by mother lode, I mean they form on the bottom of shallow seas. You think of like a productive marine environment, such as the upper part of the Gulf of Mexico today. You have a lot of rivers bringing in sediments, really rich sediments and different minerals. And you also have a lot of organic life, and especially things like algae, and they die in huge, abundant amounts of algae. And that litter goes to the bottom, this organic detritus, it builds up at the bottom, and you get this kind of ooze that over time is compressed as more materials go on top of it. And eventually, heated and compressed over millions of years, you form a geologic layer called the black shale. It's rich in organic material, and it's that compressed organic material over time which will eventually yield the oil and gas. And over time also, though, that material, some of that oil and gas may seep out, and it goes up through the layers of the earth because pressures are lower up than down. So it's going to typically seep up, and then it may eventually run into an impermeable layer where it can't go any further. And that's where we get the situation on the left. It collects in a trap. Drillers look exactly for those types of geologic situations because, again, when you drill into them, the oil or gas is easily accessible. So the oil and gas that's been harnessed up until the modern fracking era, it was in most instances born in these formations, these black shales. It trickled up out of them and collected somewhere in the geology above them. What we are doing now is we're going down to the mother lode layers. We have actually developed the technology to go all the way down to the mother lode black shale layer. And now by going horizontally through it, drilling horizontally through it, and then using the really, in a way, clever, but also monstrously destructive and invasive and industrial techniques of fracking, break apart that shale so the oil and gas can flood out, and a layer that was previously inaccessible is now accessible. Now, I bring this up with an important note towards Colorado, because one issue is that previously, if you drilled down vertically through the earth, you would have the crushed rocks and dirt that came up out of the hole, right? I mean, if you go to the beach and dig a big pit, you're pulling material up out of the earth to create that pit, and you have, all that sand. With oil and gas, all that material is referred to as drill cuttings. And they never were necessarily a problem. There was quite a lot of drill cuttings with conventional oil and gas. But you're just taking from different parts of the earth. Now, black shales are different. Black shales have contaminants embedded within them. They are very gunky layers. They're filled with heavy metals, and they're filled with radioactive heavy metals such as uranium and thorium. And when I say filled, I mean the levels of metals and radioactive heavy metals like uranium and thorium tend to be higher, and sometimes quite a bit higher in black shales. So a waste stream that wasn't necessarily a problem before, drill cuttings, now become potentially a very big problem, especially in certain oil and gas formations, because they can be too radioactive to take to local landfills. And now you start to get into some of the problems the book points out of what the industry does with this waste. Because when you drill down and then horizontally, a lateral, what the industry calls a lateral, for 1 or 2 or even 3 miles through the earth, that's quite a lot of drill cuttings. And if they're radioactive, or if they're laden with benzene or heavy metals, that can be a problem for the industry in terms of disposal. And that material, we'll get to this in a moment, no matter how toxic it is, it's going to be labeled, quote, non-hazardous, which means it can often go to a landfill, the same landfill that accepts household trash. Now, that's just one. You see on the right that list, one of the new waste streams that the industry has to worry about. Or one of the newly problematic waste streams, but we'll focus for a moment just on the first two. So brine and...
Could you hang on a second, Justin?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think there's something you have to do to the screen. Are you there to help him? Barbara?
Well, they're saying that you might have something open on your computer, and that's causing us to see a little partial obscuring of your slide.
Yeah, 1 through
Like
5.
it's like fuzzy or gyrating or something?
No, it's just a big blotch, big rectangular.
Yeah,
I think that is just this thing. So is that gone?
Well, now it's on.
Well,
on the other. Now it's on the left.
That's half
Our
the
left.
problem's gone.
Yeah, right.
that's better. Now, one more on the top. Whatever you're doing. One more.
On my screen, the only other thing is the little button that says you are sharing
Oh,
your
no,
screen.
that shouldn't. Okay. No, that's
Oh.
worse.
Yeah,
That's a
really
huge
bad.
obscuring.
We just couldn't see 1 through 5, and then the top,
Okay.
of course, there's a big rectangle on top of the screen that you're.
I didn't know what caused that.
What are you seeing it right now?
Yeah.
One at the top and one over your text on the right.
Well,
So that's
you can also, if that's a problem, one of you who has the slides, you can try showing it from your computer, and I can just convey to you when to change the slides. Because I'm not sure on my computer. It just looks like the slides, and I've always done it like this, and it's never been a problem.
Barbara, do you have his slides handy?
I believe I do. So if you want to stop sharing, Justin, let's give it a try.
Okay, sorry about that.
Oh, no, no worries. Let me see here.
I hope that will
Just have to find
remedy.
where I have them. Okay. So this is Google Drive. Yeah, it's your Google Drive link. All right, let's see if I can choose this. I think this is what we want.
Yeah,
No,
that looks
I need to get the correct slide here. And how
That's
far
it,
did you
right
get,
there. Right there.
Justin?
so. Yeah, actually, right there, the image with the trucks, that is perfect. And then just kind of focus it in, and yeah.
Okay.
And go full screen.
Well, okay. I think what I need to do. Yes, that's a great idea. Okay, that's better, I think. Still a little small. I don't want to overdo it here and lose any of it. All right, how about that? Can we work with that?
Yeah, that looks great.
Okay.
And then can everyone see it as the full screen, or is it just a small icon? Because you can expand it out maybe so it covers your full screen, or oh, that's probably just on my screen. Sorry. Okay.
I have it on full screen.
Yeah, sorry, that's just on my end. Okay, it's perfect. I got you. So yeah, and people are saying it looks good. So no, thank you for commenting and for the quick fix on that. So brine has it's an innocuous name. It sounds like an innocent fluid. It makes you think of food, or it's like something salty, but not necessarily something toxic. But it's the name for a very concerning waste stream. The other name the industry uses is produced water. I know produced water is getting recently a lot of attention in New Mexico and Colorado as well. And you'll see why in a moment. Brine produced water is just an absolutely copious waste stream. And we can actually maybe skip like 2 slides down, because I'll just, yeah, perfect. The one with the moon. So this is just to give you an idea of how much brine or wastewater the industry produces. It's about 3 billion gallons a day across the entire United States. That's 1 trillion gallons a year. So if you took that 1 trillion gallons, again, that's a year's worth of the oil and gas industry's brine or wastewater or produced water, all the same thing. If you took that 1 trillion gallons and packed it into a standard oil barrel, which is about waist high, and you stack those barrels atop one another, you could form a line of barrels of oil field wastewater to the moon and back about 28 times. That's an extraordinary waste stream, right? The industry does not want it. They want oil, gas, natural gas liquids. This is something they don't want. And they have never had a good solution on how to actually deal with this stuff. And so, yeah, now, sorry, we can go back up 2 slides to the picture with the trucks. So this, again, shows you have a copious waste stream. You're going to need a lot of equipment to move it off the well pad, and especially during a period referred to as flowback. Which comes in the weeks and months after the well first comes online, after a fracked well or unconventional well first comes online. There's this really aggressive discharge of waste that comes back to the surface. And this includes not just this naturally occurring brine, but it would also include some of the material shot down the well in the frack. So that could mean it could have some really nasty and even unknown chemicals used in the frack. Some of the used frack sand would come back up, and this surges back to the surface, and it literally would rain down upon the workers who are tasked with trying to clean this material up. Often this comes up so quickly that the industry will have to run it really deal with it in what I would say is a makeshift way. So in some states, these are now illegal, but use an impoundment, run the waste into an open air impoundment, which could be right in a community. And this is highly concerning because you are running a really complex and toxic industrial waste stream into a giant open pit right next to homes and cows. And this just gives you an idea of how many trucks it takes just to get that stuff off the well pad when you're in this period of flow back. And we can go down. And yeah, we can still go down. And just the writing on the side there was saying that brine, or yeah, focus right above the moon one. So yeah, salts of the earth. Perfect. Thank you. So brine can contain quite a lot of volatile organics. So these are known carcinogens such as benzene. You may also have elevated levels of heavy metals, concerning ones like lead and arsenic, and then you can have elevated levels of radium, this very worrisome radioactive heavy metal. Brine also can have quite a lot of salt, really toxic levels of salt, and this is what this article is referring to. This is from 1953. It's a piece out of the Michigan Geological Survey. And what's so stunning to me here is you have this very level-headed acknowledgement by government that brine is a major problem for the industry, and not just a problem, it really is the primary problem the industry is facing. And again, this is well before fracking came around. There's always been brine. You always are pulling up this liquid as you pull up oil and gas. And I'm just going to read through some of the quotes because now, as the industry is considering, oh, should we treat brine, or what happens when a brine truck spills? I mean, you have in many instances a toxic waste spill, and in some instances a radioactive waste spill as well. But they may, and they were not even focused on the radioactivity at this time. They really were just focused on the salt and the benzene. But still they knew it was problematic. So they say brine waters are highly concentrated solutions of salts and other minerals. We still know that to be quite accurate. We know a little bit better about some of those minerals now. And they say, which when undiluted can do severe damage to animal, aquatic, and vegetable life and to freshwater supplies. So very clearly stating that brine poses a risk to freshwater supplies. And they get into more detail. All plans involving surface storage or controlled discharge of brine waters proved unsatisfactory. This is really significant. They say we tried this, we tried that, and we have not been able to appropriately deal with this stuff. Groundwaters in the vicinity of brine-producing oil fields became polluted and unfit for private or public use. Surface vegetation, including shrubs and trees, were destroyed. Property damage near the brine ponds and down water courses resulted in numerous lawsuits. That's significant. Damage to fish life followed the polluting streams and lake waters. So the brine literally was able to enter the food chain. And several cities, towns, and industries became alarmed at possible permanent damage to their water supplies because of oil field brines. So, part of why this is so powerful to me is they give a very helpful list of what is at risk when you have oil field brine being moved around, which you do at every single wellhead in Colorado and across the country. To me, it's also a very level-headed assessment. Now I read reports regularly from different state agencies, and they're very hesitant to be critical of this industry, right? Or to state a spill. Even if a spill is massively problematic, you still will read a report about that spill, and there's this odd language which somehow makes it seem like it isn't necessarily that bad. And I found this often in my reporting. If you go further back, and I think, the industry has been able to get more and more involved with our regulatory system, and certainly we see that playing out in the present moment. It was involved always, but it wasn't as heavily involved. And so I find that when you have government papers from the 50s, 40s, and 30s, they were more open to admitting that some of these waste streams were highly problematic. It's harder to find such sort of analysis these days often. We can go down past the moon slide now. So that's showing again that 28 barrels. I'm perfect. Focus on this one. Thank you. Okay, so I say brine can have this radioactive signature. The radioactive element of concern, at least of primary concern initially, is radium. Radium is a very interesting radioactive element. It is in the same column of the periodic table as calcium. That just means that the outside of the radium atom and the outside of the calcium atom, the electron makeup resembles each other. They have a similar, and which gives them similar chemical properties, and that becomes really significant because radium can act in a way like calcium, and whereas calcium goes to the bones, radium also has a tendency to go to the bones. And by go to the bones, I mean, you take minerals into your body, they accumulate in different places. Calcium will end up in the bone, and radium will also end up in the bone. Not all of it, but if you take in radium, some of it is likely to end up in the bones. Now that's a problem because it's a radioactive element. Calcium is helpful for your bones. The radioactive element is the last thing on Earth you want in your bones because radium is going to do what radioactive elements do, which is every so often blast off a little piece of itself. That's what we call radiation. And then having lost that piece of itself, radium literally becomes another element, in this case, radon. Radon is also radioactive, which means at some point radon is going to blast off a piece of itself, more radiation. It becomes another element. In this case, an isotope of polonium. Polonium is also radioactive. It's going to blast off a piece of itself, more radiation. And all that's happening in your bone structure. Whereas your skin has some ability to block alpha particles, beta particles, certain types of radiation, the inner spaces of your body do not have that ability. And so they're really at risk to radiation. So radium is of concern. We also have the story of the Radium Girls. Some people may know that, but really was an important case of industrial contamination documented in the United States. Radium and a variety of different radioactive elements, as radioactivity was first being discovered and analyzed and assessed in the early 20th century, scientists and industry used it to do a lot of different tricks. And one trick was if you put radium into this paint with zinc, radium excited a molecule containing zinc, it caused the paint to glow. And so you had this glowing paint, which was very cool because then you could have anything you painted with the paint glow. And so a big job became dial painting or watch and clock painting. It was a job that often fell to women. They would be working in factories and they'd be using this radioactive paint in these tiny little brushes and dip the brush in the paint and then paint the hands or dials of clocks or watches. So again, they would glow. How cool. You have a glowing timepiece. And then the women would, put the brush back in the paint the hand or dial, put the brush back in the paint. And if you've done fine painting, you know that the tip of the paintbrush is going to get dry. So then you put the brush tip in your mouth to keep it firm. And that's exactly what these women did. That was a little task called tipping. And over time, through that task, they ingested significant amounts of radium, eventually developed these really horrendous bone cancers. And there was an amazing medical examiner named Dr. Harrison Martland, who really helped solve this industrial dilemma. And yeah, I'm just reading that someone posted about Radium Girls, the book by Kate Moore. Kate Moore is a brilliant author who wrote a book on the story of the Radium Girls. And Kate and I corresponded for my reporting because she really dug deep on this topic and found some really, really interesting things about some of the scientists who looked at the Radium Girls. One thing that comes out in Kate Moore's book, and it's a fantastic book, and I think it's been made into a play recently. So it's a very powerful story. But one thing that comes out in that story is the industrial scientists of the day and some of the best scientists of the day, well-regarded cancer researchers, they were dismissive of the idea that radium caused bone cancer and that these women developed cancers because of their exposure to radium in the workplace. They just didn't think it was happening. And they went to court for the radium industry, defending the industry, saying there's no way that their cancers came from that. These women are just trying to make money off this poor industry, et cetera, et cetera. Dr. Harrison Martland, the medical examiner, he followed the pathway of science. He did autopsies on many of the Radium Girls. He found radium in their bones. He found radium, again, decays, being a radioactive element, blast off radiation, decays to radon. And radon is a radioactive gas gases move differently through the body than metals. Radium is a metal, radon is a gas. So when radium decays, blasts off radiation, becomes radon, it has to escape somewhere. And Dr. Martland was actually able to do what's called an exhalation test. He could measure the charged air that these women were exhaling. Essentially, they had become like human radioactive chimneys because the radium in their bones was constantly churning out radon, and the radon, some of it would escape through the mouth as they exhaled. And so he could measure their radioactive breath. And this became really one of the most indisputable forms of proof to show that they were indeed harboring an internal radioactive source. And so he really shut the haters down with science, with really good, clever science. And their bones were wildly radioactive. And when he did the autopsies, that added further proof. All to say, EPA is very concerned now about radium. We know even at levels that aren't necessarily that high, but over time, when radium is ingested, it can build up and lead to these lethal cancers. So we have a definition by EPA of radioactive liquid waste. And this becomes important. If you're going to talk about radioactivity and use this very strong word, radioactive waste, well, what is radioactive waste? It changes for each radioactive element. Different radioactive elements can exhibit much more or much less in different types of radioactivity, and the amounts, the levels can be vary greatly, very high, very low. Some radioactive elements only decay once every billion years, and some decay once every like 10 seconds. So all these things are tabulated, and we have different levels of radioactive waste depending on the element. Now for radium, it's a pretty strict level because radium is reasonably radioactive, and that level is 60 picocuries per liter. Now radium-226 and radium-228, these are just different forms or isotopes of radium. When the EPA is looking at this, and also when other agencies like the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is looking at this, they may look at the individual isotope, radium-226, they can look at radium-228, or they can look at the addition of amounts of radium-226 and radium-228. It's all going to be 60. It's all going to be the limit of 60 picocuries per liter, which means if you have 60 picocuries per liter or more of radium in a liquid, you can legitimately say, according to EPA's guidelines, that's radioactive waste. That is what that definition means. It's a very powerful bit of knowledge.
Yep.
Yeah, it's a powerful bit of knowledge because then you can say, well, let's look at the radium levels in brine. And so you have it right there. Marcellus happens to have very high radium levels in the brine. And we see that the average level in the Marcellus, the average level of 226 and radium-228, you have it right there. Radium-226, 8,344 picocuries per liter, obviously well above 60. The average level of radium-228 in the Marcellus, 986. When you add those together, it's about 9,330. And so that average level is taking us far, far above the threshold of 60. And then you see that the high level of radium in Marcellus brine, it's been recorded as high as 28,500. So we are legitimately dealing, according to these definitions at least, with radioactive waste. And we can go to the next slide, I believe, which conveys the levels across the country. Yeah, and I do have Denver on there, right? So the Denver-Julesburg play is interesting. The levels, as at least they've been recorded in the data that exists, and none of the oil and gas formations have exhaustive data. You'd think the industry would want to sample every single well and find out the brine's radium levels. It's often not the case, or at least I don't have access to that sort of sampling, but you do have some data, and the data in Colorado shows that the levels are significantly lower than what we find in the Marcellus, but still above this important threshold of radioactive waste, about 600 picocuries per liter. And that's coming from the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment's own report in 2019. So this becomes an interesting find because none of the trucks that I see regularly moving around oil and gas formations convey that the material is radioactive. The workers are not told this. And the communities where this is happening right in front of them are not told this. And we can go to the next slide now. Because a much more problematic radioactivity issue comes from the brine and that's in the sludge. But before we get there, while we're on this slide, we'll just answer this question. Well, where does all the wastewater go? Where does all the brine go? Across the country, 96% of it goes to injection wells, and you see a truck on its way to an injection well that's going right through Barnesville, Ohio, small downtown. And of course, there's no placard on the truck. You either see the word brine or you see the word residual or residual waste. When I say placard, I mean a formal DOT hazmat marker that would indicate either A, the material is hazardous, or B, it's radioactive. You don't see that on that truck, even though it's going through the middle of the town. And then an injection well, and I'll get into more detail later about why they're so problematic. But here in Ohio, you have one sited right across the street from a Taco Bell. Now, this is a place where we just learned this waste can have high lead, high arsenic, benzene, a known carcinogen, and be radioactive enough to be called radioactive waste. And in this instance, this is in Cambridge, Ohio, on the right, that Google's map shot. You can sit in the Taco Bell and watch the trucks dump off brine at the injection well, right as you eat your chalupa. To me, it's a stunning window into the regulatory failure that's been allowed to develop. And the truck driver may often have no idea that they are handling material that's risky, which isn't to say they're an idiot. It's more to say that they've been deceived and misled by their employers and really face a major health risk because they're not handling material they think is dangerous, and yet it's quite dangerous. We can go to the next slide. Yeah, so this is a really nice little graphic. So you just imagine a material that has a lot of sediment in it. And I always use coffee because like most people know what it is and drink it. And you know that, if you have coffee brewed in like a French press or something, you let it sit for a little bit, there's going to be a little skein of sludge at the bottom, right? So you think about brine, again, it has a lot of salt. The salts don't always settle out immediately, although they do settle out against equipment, but it's really the heavy metals and some of the dirt and other gunk in the brine that will settle out as a sludge at the bottom, right? Radium, it's a heavy metal, and it's a heavy metal, which just means, it will likely have a propensity to like sink to the bottom of the glass or the tank or the truck. So you form in any container that is carrying brine, you will form a little skein of sludge on the bottom. And in the Marcellus, where we have very high levels of minerals in the brine, you will form, a pretty hefty deposit of sludge. That sludge has to regularly be cleaned out and taken somewhere because you can't drive around a truck if it just starts filling up with sludge. Eventually, you got to clean it out and take a new load, and that sludge will build up to a point where you have to clean it out. Same thing happening in a tank at the wellhead. That photo on the right, by the way, is from Colorado, another one of Julie's photos. Well, that sludge has a problem. If you have radium in the brine and you have heavy metals in the brine, and you also can have other contaminants, such as in the flowback period, as I mentioned, you have fracking chemicals resurfacing. That still might be mixed in here because these trucks carry flowback as well as brine. This stuff is settling out in the sludge, and the sludge is a concentration of these contaminants. So while radium can be reasonably high in brine, the radium in sludge can just really be extraordinarily high and really pose a significant radiological hazard, often so high that that material, the sludge, would not be able to be taken to a local landfill because it would set off a radiation detector. Now, the landfills don't have this because of the oil and gas industry. They have this because historically, many industries have tried to sneak shady stuff into landfills, including radioactive shady stuff. And so landfills have gotten wise, and sometimes it's by law, and they have to check things coming in. They have often a big scanner, kind of like you would have at a toll booth. Sometimes it's with a handheld device. But this sludge is so radioactive that it was setting off landfill alarms in a variety of oil and gas fields. That has happened. So the industry wants to dump waste in the place that's closest possible, not because they, hate their neighbors, but because it's just the cheapest and easiest place to do it. So it's easier to go to a local landfill. That would be the first desire. But if your sludge is setting off a radioactive sensor, or if the landfill is really paying attention to what's in this stuff, that pathway may be closed off, and then the industry has to figure out what we're going to do with this sludge. Now, there are several low-level radioactive waste sites. They're actually, at this point, all located out west. There's one in the Utah desert in Clive, Utah, operated by a company called Energy Solutions. And these are appropriately designated places for dealing with low-level radioactive waste, which is how this waste really should be designated with. But what's really happened is this kind of patchwork black hole of the industry trying to shuttle this waste to states where laws are easier. And so it's great. I know Colorado has recently paid a lot of attention to what they would call T-norm waste, technologically enhanced naturally occurring radioactive materials. Sludge would fall into that definition of T-norm. But if a state develops stricter rules, I think you still have to monitor the landfills very closely, because it's very easy to, at the local landfill level, and this is coming from many, many sources conveying how this happens, escape that. So one way you can get around this is you would just pack a truck with radioactive material placed in the center of the truck. And this is coming from workers who describe this to me. And then you wrap that material with non-radioactive material. So the radioactivity is really cloaked in the middle of the truck. Now, of course, if you went in with a sample like a temperature sensor into a chicken or something and sample the middle, you would capture that. But if you're just driving through a portal that is doing a general scan of the truck, you may well miss that. And if someone is just walking around with a handheld device around the back of the truck, they may well miss that. And workers have really described all sorts of ways that radioactive oil and gas waste can get into a state's landfill, even if they have restrictive rules. I don't necessarily have evidence of that in Colorado. I'm not saying it's not happening in Colorado, but I'm also saying I don't have specific stories of that. My stories of this happening come from North Dakota and then also from the Marcellus. But it's a problem, and certainly in Colorado, you should pay attention to these pathways. But what often ends up happening is the operators will take the waste to states where the rules are a little bit easier. So in this case, it's been Montana. Montana's become a major dumping ground for the Bakken, for North Dakota's radioactive oil field waste. But there's a constant ping-ponging around. And a lot of this really happens under the cover of darkness, away from the eyes of the regulators. And really the only way I learned some of these things are when whistleblowing workers, either the ones driving the trucks or the one working at the landfills, come out and really convey what's happening. Because it's hard to know exactly what's in a truck going to a landfill. We can go to the next slide. And I know people are going to have a lot of questions. I want to leave space for that, but I want to touch on just two other important things before we do that. So one, this is very important now for Colorado. The industry has moved away from injection wells. A whole chapter of my book deals with the problem of injection wells. Injection wells are not guarded and guided by a real science, okay? There is not a body of science that conveys that you can safely inject millions of gallons of complex toxic fluids with various toxicities, which we barely understand how they interact on the surface, where we know the pressure and temperature, let alone the subsurface, where pressures are higher, temperatures are higher, how that's all going to move around underground. And by the way, the underground environment is not a storage locker with no exit pathways. It is a porous, constantly shifting space. And injection wells now are leaking across the country. Really, by nature, when you inject the waste down, it is inherently leaking from the beginning, because again, there are no storage lockers where you can shut the gate below the earth. You just have layers that may be less leaky or more leaky and may contain this waste for longer, but it will leak out eventually. That was all laid out in early industry and government conferences that happened back in the early 70s. The EPA was very skeptical of injection wells early on. And I think now the industry has seen that communities are also really skeptical of injection wells, and they're expensive. And so they're moving towards this idea of treatment. The problem again with treatment is if you have a complex waste stream with contaminants, such as you do with brine, and one of those contaminants is radium, a radioactive contaminant, and you try and remove all the contaminants, you are inherently concentrating them. And so right here you see, the financial community so excited about oil and gas waste. This is where you should invest your money. And we can go to the next slide. But really, they have not recognized that there have been absolute radiological disasters that have resulted from the industry trying to treat this waste. These are both stories I did coming from the Marcellus region, both instances where different companies were very enthusiastic, got funders about this idea of treating the fracking wastewater. In the instance on the right, the facility was called Fairmont Brine. They were planning to pull salts from it, use it in road salts. They were going to treat the water to this, really clean quality. It could be reused in fracking. The facility on the left was actually the union of a Colorado energy company, Antero Resources, which is very prolific in the Marcellus Utica region, and Veolia, which is this fancy French environmental services company with headquarters in Paris. They wanted to treat the waste to such a degree that their own engineer or the project's engineer said that you could have food grade quality salt come from this. So this is what they sold to investors in the communities, and yet the result was they were unable to treat this material. The facility on the left was called Clearwater. It shuttered in about 22 months. The facility on the right lasted for a couple years, but what they left behind was a massive radioactive wasteland. And we can go to the next slide. So typically a place closes down in the oil and gas industry, they put up a gate, someone has a bunch of no trespassing signs, or a new company buys it, and you're not allowed to enter. And that's hard as a journalist or a scientist because you don't know what happened there. In this case, in West Virginia, that's the site of the Fairmont brine plant I just was talking about, not the one operated by Veolia and Antero. This is the other one. Fairmont brine was operated by a Pittsburgh area-based engineering firm. And when they were not able to successfully treat brine, it is a very complex task. It involves a lot of technological know-how. And really, because of the salt content, because of the various chemicals in brine, it just makes it an extraordinarily difficult technical challenge. And these companies have failed time and again in being able to solve it. And when you, there's more to that though than that sentence suggests. When you fail to treat brine, remember, you've been taking truckload after truckload of this stuff. These plants have not been able to appropriately treat it, so they end up building up this huge amount of waste on site. We know radium is there in the brine. It's enhanced when you build up a lot of the waste, of a lot of the solid waste. And so this place became really smothered in radioactivity. And what was unfortunate here, and just the levels, by the way, for example, the EPA later visited after I published this article and found levels of like 3.1 milliroentgens per hour. Just to give you an idea, this is a comparison I use a lot because it's so powerful. People have flown above the Chernobyl exclusion zone in a plane with a Geiger counter and determined the radioactivity levels of basically the entire exclusion zone, except for right where the reactor core is, because you can't fly above that. The levels found on this site are higher than 99% of the Chernobyl exclusion zone. Now, of course, not higher than the reactor core spot, but higher than most of the Chernobyl exclusion zone, including some very contaminated parts of it. Now, we have labeled that an exclusion zone because we know the levels are high. It doesn't mean you're going to go to a place like that and just melt like a cartoon and die right away, but it's not a safe place for humans. It's an exclusion zone. Yet here, when we went to the site, we found out that it had become a party spot for the local kids. It's an industrial place, abandoned, really pretty view of the town, and you can watch the sunsets, and kids were hanging out here drinking, having bonfires, and you can see by the graffiti that's all clear. I mean, they were literally partying in radioactive fracking waste. So when I hear the industry so excited about treatment and these amazing things, we're going to take the lithium out, well, I haven't seen them successfully able to do that, at least in the Marcellus. And I've seen some absolute massive disasters that they've caused in attempting to do that. So I'm very skeptical, and I think that process needs to be really just first critiqued. And if it isn't able to go forward, you always have to ask the question: what are you doing with the radium? Do you even know about radium? Do you know there's two isotopes? I mean, if a company doesn't know that, then like right out the door, they have no place trying to do this. Do you know what radium-228 is? What does radium decay into? I mean, these are good questions to ask because I know now you have companies applying for, for projects like this in places like Colorado. But really the catch-22 question, and there's an amazing American Petroleum Institute document which lays this out, is even if you successfully find a way to treat oil and gas wastewater, even in a formation like the Denver Julesburg, where radium levels are relatively low, you're treating so much waste that you are collecting an extraordinary amount of radium. And so you may have successfully treated it, but you've now gathered all the bad stuff out of the brine. And what are you going to do with that? What is your plan for that copious sludge or filter cake-like material that you will inherently accrue if you successfully treat it? And I think that needs to be asked of any company trying to get into this project, because that becomes an additional, really a corollary problem. The radioactive sludge that this place was producing when they were trying to get rid of it and not just letting it splatter all over the site, they were running into all sorts of problems because loads were getting kicked out of landfills because it was too radioactive. So from the start, they had trouble, A, treating it, and then B, getting rid of the sludge they did pull out of it when they were able to, kind of half treat it. I don't think their treatment was ever truly successful. And you have a quote there from the worker. This is important also, because this is where I think this type of reporting can really break open divides. The environmental community has been pit against the oil field worker community, and yet no one has been more harmed than the workers. Certainly communities and homes right up against the industry and schools are at risk, but the workers are literally smothered in this material, and they're sold these jobs on the idea that these jobs they're cleaning up the industry's waste stream. It's beneficial for the environment. And that's a beautiful thing. If you're in an area where there's not a lot of industry and oil and gas has always been there, and you can clean up an industry and make it less a problem for society, that's an exciting job. That's often what these workers are told. What really is happening is they're putting their health on the line. Absolutely. So this facility, we know that 2 of the workers have recently died of cancer, one of glioblastoma, type of brain cancer, and the other of stomach cancer. And Sean himself, who really is a wonderful human, is quite sick. He used to work these tough manual labor jobs, and now the only job he can take is working at the local supermarket because he just doesn't have the stamina he used to. He has breathing issues, and there's a variety of health complications that really haven't been thoroughly assessed, but I think certainly questioning whether this job played a role is an important question. These workers were working in very dusty environments. Dust is just absolutely nefarious because it's a very powerful way to bring tiny little harmful things. We learned this with COVID, right, into the intimate space of our human lungs, and dust can also carry some hazardous metals, including the radium, right into your lungs. So it's a problem. And maybe stop there for now because that's quite a lot of material. I think one other issue, I'll leave it, if someone has questions, but maybe let's go down and we'll leave it on this slide. So let's go down further, a little bit further. That's the exemption, which labels all of the waste streams I've talked about. They are, according to federal law, non-hazardous. This is a major problem before the Halliburton loophole. And really even more of a win for the industry was the Benson and Bevel Amendments exemption to the Resource Conservation Recovery Act. It determines that all of their waste, all of these waste streams I've just talked about, it could actually be as radioactive as the Chernobyl core, but it does not matter. Under US law, it will be determined and labeled as non-hazardous. So that's why you don't see hazmat placarding on the trucks. It's non-hazardous. Because of that, by the way, it can also be imported into the United States, and that has happened. We can go to the next slide. And I'm just trying to go a couple more down. I want to get to maybe one more, sorry. That's the site where the import is company that's importing radioactive oil field waste from foreign countries, operates a facility in West Texas desert. That's what it looks like if you fly over in a small plane. Very neatly organized tanks that appear to be open to wind and air. That's a worry. Railroad Commission of Texas doesn't seem to think so, but that's a longer story. And let's go down probably like 2 more slides. Land spreading, big problem. Sorry, 2 more again. And it's good. If you see something here you want to ask a question on, ask me later. Sorry, 2 more, probably 3 more, because this is Harrison Martlin's paper with the Radium Girls. This is a legal case from Louisiana where they actually pointed that workers' cancers are indeed attributable to the radiation exposure in the industry. A stunning case. That's the book that the lawyer wrote about it. If you really want to get deep into this, beyond my book, read that book. It's incredible. And let's see, I think like one or two more, maybe. Okay, one more. Oh, I see it. There it is. Perfect. Okay, so the second pathway, and we'll stop for questions, but I'll leave it, so we can talk about this later or follow up later, is the radon pathway. Radon is a radioactive gas. Now, while radium decays to radon, and so you bring a lot of brine to the surface, you put it in a tank, that tank is inherently generating radon. You also have radon coming up in the natural gas itself and in the oil itself. And this can pose a significant risk because radon decays to a series of radioactive metals. Those metals can build up inside a natural gas pipeline, inside a natural gas processing plant's valves and pumps, inside the pumps at a oil refinery or a petrochemical plant, and they can build up to levels that are truly dangerous. That puts a risk to the workers who have to clean that equipment. And in my book, there's a very powerful story told by a Colorado worker who does that job of cleaning. Again, it just looks like a valve or pump covered with gunk. It came from the oil field setting. Well, it's radioactive. And so as they clean it, just like the dentist, like chiseling plaque off a tooth, they chisel this stuff off, generate an incredible amount of dust. If they're not appropriately protected, which often they're not, they're breathing that in. So the hazard can go far from the oil field, but you also raise the risk of what happens when you have emissions along the natural gas pipeline system. As you do at a compressor station, you have tremendous emissions. Now, this has not been studied that I know of. I'm trying to get scientists to look at it, but we would expect, based on the oil and gas industry's own reports and science, that those emissions at compressor stations would be elevated in radioactivity. And that's just because you're opening the vent of the pipeline. And we know from industry's own data that you have quite a lot of radon in the pipeline. So of course, if you vent the pipeline, which happens at a compressor station, you would expect some of the radioactivity to be vented, and really a copious amount because the emissions there are tremendous. And I did just co-author a paper with a Colorado scientist named Detlef Helmig, where we examined emissions downwind of the refinery, the Sunco refinery on the north side of Denver, and indeed found that when the wind blows from the direction of the refinery, radioactivity levels were 2 to 3 times higher. And I'm saying the sentence in that way because that's how I can say it scientifically. So we can't pin it with that data on the refinery, but we can say that when the wind blows from the direction of the refinery, there are higher radioactivity levels in the air, and it's statistically significant higher levels. Okay, let's take a break. That was like a major whirl through, I know, a very complicated topic. So you all were good listeners. Happy to answer any questions.
Well, all that you showed us is very consequential. And it does bring up questions that come to mind. Maybe you can talk, would you care to talk about whether there's any evidence that the industry is succeeding in safely ridding the fracking wastewater of radioactive radium or any other radioactive material in the sludge or the brine that's in the wastewaters? In any treatment?
No, this is a great question. And I'm just looking at some of the, people are asking good questions in the comments too. So I'll try and address your question, Amy, and a really good question someone just asked in the comments. No, I don't see evidence that they're doing this well. That exemption that I just mentioned, as well as the fact that radioactive oil field waste is not regulated under the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, has allowed the industry to operate under this aura of really minimal regulation on this. I mean, there is no federal agency that is regulating radioactive oil field waste, not the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. They regulate medical waste, they regulate the nuclear industry, but not oil and gas waste, and not the EPA. EPA does not regulate radioactive oil field waste. So, you just imagine what a profit-driven industry does when they don't have to do something, which is they don't do it. So they are completely sloppy, very reckless, and regularly put communities and their workers at risk when it comes to this waste. Of course, they can put out very glossy brochures to say they're doing the exact opposite, but I have found that the evidence doesn't jive with those glossy brochures. The question on the right, what happens if one of those unmarked trucks get into a highway crash? Now, this is a phenomenal question. Industry is very clever. Often when they go into an area, the first thing they do is give money to the police, the fire, the schools, right? And also, veterans and older people who have respect in the community. I mean, really nefarious. This happened in Pennsylvania. The first groups they connected with were veterans groups and hunters, because they knew these were kind of like the old lion guards of the community. And if they were okay with this, they could talk other people or strong arm other people into being okay with it. Give money to the fire department. And that becomes key when it comes to this scenario of what happens when a brine truck spills. So first responders, firefighters, you think would be the first people to speak out against this, because they recognize that, oh my goodness, this truck is unmarked. What's really in this truck? I don't know. They don't know what's in this, boss, when the thing crashes. Well, that's oil filled wastewater. Okay, well, what's in the wastewater? Well, it's non-hazardous. Okay, we just learned the exemption, it is non-hazardous, but what's actually in it? Well, it's some salt. Just some salt. Anything else? Yeah, it's some other stuff, but just salt, really. Now, a good firefighter or an investigatively minded firefighter, fire chief, would go beyond that. What's stunning to me is very, very few have. There is one fire chief from the Marcellus Utica region. From that whole region, one has spoken out, and they have spoken out in a brilliant way, and they're featured in the 3rd chapter in the book. They have a whole section, and their quotes are amazing, and their points are very, very strong. But what I'm trying to say is, this is a great scenario. It's not a great scenario, but it's a great scenario to show that the industry has really worked into this system. So the people who would typically be ringing the alarm bell, such as a first responder, they are not ringing the alarm bell. Are they not because they don't know, or because they just got a new truck, or because they're buddy with the industry? I don't know the answer to that, but they are not ringing the alarm bell. And so thus these trucks crash regularly, and that truck crash will be treated as just, like a truck full of corn crashed. And you can, you'll have a contaminated site. Now they will clean it up. It's not to say they'll just let the stuff seep into the soil, but it will seep into the soil, and it will contaminate the soil. And sometimes the cleanup maybe is more rigorous, but the general problem is not dealt with, which is the fact that this stuff is unmarked and people don't initially know what's in the spill. And there's been instances in Ohio where brine trucks crashed right next to a reservoir. It leaked into a creek that went into the reservoir. Well, guess what? Radium showed up in the reservoir from the oil and gas waste, and yet the brine trucks still are able to drive by this reservoir, every single day. It really didn't change things in the end, even though to me, that finding was stunning.
How about, can you talk about, you mentioned that there was a breath test that they used on the radium girls. Can you use a Geiger counter, urine samples, other tests for readings of radioactivity that are found in the bodies of maybe perhaps deceased or living cancer patients, so that you could prove and identify the sources and even the locations?
Yeah, no, so this is an absolutely brilliant question. Dr. Marco Kaltofen, the scientist who I started, he had that great quote about radioactivity coming from underground to above ground. In a different instance involving the nuclear industry and that side of the radioactivity picture, he was able to look through the ashes of a woman whose husband worked at a nuclear weapons production facility, and he would bring home radioactivity on his clothing. She would be exposed to it. She developed cancer. She passed away, and he found radioactivity in her remains. Now, that was a rare instance that a scientist had a bond with people and access to those remains. Not unfortunately, it's very hard to do that experiment with humans. So I can't answer that question, but I have asked it, and I think people should look at that. I mean, you could take bone. You don't have to wait for someone to pass away and look for their ashes. You could take bone. I think it's called a bone. It's like a bone biopsy. You take a very small sample of bone, and this can be done, I think, even without like a large stay in the hospital. You could go in, it's a complex procedure like a spinal tap, but you could take a sample of bone. There would be a way where you could focus on an at-risk subgroup, like say the workers who deal with the sludge most regularly, and you could do that. Would you be able to detect it like Harrison Martland did simply with the exhaled breath? I'm not sure, because those women really did end up receiving quite a significant dose. But it's an interesting scientific question, and it's certainly worth asking. And another way to look at that would be you take workers who have worked 10 years in oil field sludge, and then maybe you have a set of workers who just worked with computers or something where we wouldn't suspect radioactivity, and you do breath tests of like 100 of them from each community and look at the levels. I mean, these are all great questions that I hope at some point the research community does start asking, because then we'll start to learn things.
Right. Does anyone else have questions out there? Here, someone made a comment about not too many years care and speed. Years back, Weld County used the waste fluids to de-ice roads in winter. It was also applied to the runways at the airport in Weld County. And as we have witnessed, solid waste have been applied to crops to enhance the soil to grow corn. As the solid waste is very dark black, it is thought to be advantageous to apply to local crops. Oh my.
Yeah. No, thank you very much, Karen. It is great to see you on here. For the question. So yeah, this does happen, as Karen suggests. I went through that slide quickly, but in Oklahoma, drilling waste, a different waste stream that we didn't talk about so much here, but still a problematic one, is spread on farm fields under the misguided belief that the waste is good for crops and cows. Really, what you're dealing with is the industry has an overabundance of waste. They need to get rid of the stuff, and they've developed some pretty cunning and I would say evil ways of doing that. And one of the simplest ways to get rid of a waste stream is to do this little like trick of wording, and it's often regulatory wording, and say it's not a waste stream anymore, it's a beneficial product, because then suddenly like we can make money off of it, and we got rid of the waste just by calling it beneficial, right? Beneficial reuse. So if you can spread it on roads, that's great. We get rid of all this oil field waste, and now communities don't have to buy de-icer. And a similar kind of like weird calculus going on with spreading the waste on farmland. But the communities in many oil and gas areas have been sold on this. They've been ingrained into the culture, and this is done day in and day out in Oklahoma. Colorado has had land spreading as well. I visited a site with Karen actually where we saw it actively occurring. And yeah, the road spreading example is where the idea that brine has a lot of salt, and salt is used as a road de-icer. So let's just use the oil field wastewater to de-ice the roads. Now in cold areas like Colorado and Ohio with a lot of snow, this can be really attractive to a local municipality. Often winter road maintenance is one of their biggest costs. So if you have the oil and gas industry saying, hey, you don't have to spend money on salt de-icer anymore, we're going to give you our salty, wastewater. I mean, it's really the same stuff. It's salty, it's brine, and it works on roads. Like that can be an attractive offer. The problem again is brine is a really complex chemical mixture, elevated benzene, elevated heavy metals, elevated radium, and you don't want to spread those things on roads.
Emily Tracy wrote that she has searched on the Colorado Regulatory Agency website, Energy and Carbon Management Commission, on radioactivity. You don't find much old radioactivity, but I can point to one thing that can help you. I think, let's see, I'm trying to put it in the chat. I'm sorry.
Oh no, go on. I just was looking at it.
No, I was going to say that we do have TENORM, capital TENORM, regulations for Colorado. And if you look at that, if on page 10, you will see that oil and gas is exempt from the regulations that are in that TENORM regulation. I think it's under the energy department for Colorado. So if that helps, Emily, that you'd be surprised. And they even list some of the things that are exempt for Colorado, including, well, you'll just look for it.
Um,
I think it's tailings, I think, are exempt, and all kinds of other things.
yeah,
are
Colorado
exempt.
does, you will find some material, like you said. I mean, if you look up TNORM, which again stands for Technologically Enhanced Naturally Occurring Radioactive Materials and Oil and Gas Waste, some of Colorado's agencies will have a good bit of information on that. You should still be able to find that. Um, the question, by the way, about coal mining, this is a great question. Yes, coal mining would have TNORM as well. Coal waste does. The levels are significantly lower. They're still elevated above background. And if you have a lot of coal waste and you have, say, water running through the coal waste and potentially collecting contaminants, it still can be a problem. If you're burning waste or the exhaust from like a coal power plant, that would have elevated levels, but they are not nearly as elevated as they are in the oil field. But even you can look up the research on radioactivity in coal mining, and it's still there are some people who are quite concerned about it. But it's kind of like, if you're concerned about that, you would definitely be concerned about oil and gas waste, because the levels are just significantly higher. Radioactivity gets concentrated to a much greater degree deep down in the formation before we even get to the surface. And a lot of that has to do with radium's propensity to really be highly elevated in the brine, in the wastewater.
Here's another comment from Nancy Jackson. Arapahoe County resisted having any injection wells. I'm not sure if that has changed in the last 2 years, but we sent our produced water to Weld County. Oh, that's nice, where they seem to want it. Now I know why.
And this is a great example of of this kind of like trading around of waste I talked about. So, Weld is a big drilling county. Why do they want it? I mean, someone is making money off that waste. So maybe they want it because the more they take in, the more money they make. And a county that's a little bit more critical, or the voices of critical people in the community are allowed to shine, because I think there's many critical people, I know there are in Weld County too, then they might be able to say, not in our area. Well, it's going to end up somewhere else. And so, just like North Dakota going to Montana, so, one county going to Weld, the places where the rules are more lax will end up accumulating more waste. It's seems to be one of the laws of the industry.
Paul Cullen has a question. I suspect that coal mining has a similar radioactivity problem. Is this problem common to every form of mining?
Yeah, so I was just talking about that with coal mining. And yes, it would be, one of my best experts on this focuses also on TNORM with other mining, like some minerals more than others. For example, phosphorus ends up pulling up quite a lot of radioactivity. So this is a big problem in Florida, where you have these big phosphorus mines. And again, you're dealing with radium. And they, again, are wanting to use the stuff to pave roads. That's a big fight that's been going on in Florida for some time now. You might have heard the story of like this radioactive waste pond outside Tampa broke a couple of years ago. That had to do with phosphorus mining. So yes, not all mining, but it's interesting the way certain minerals, certain things that we pull up from the earth are much more likely than others to be elevated with radioactivity.
Well, Emily also has experience. She says, thanks, I have decades of experience with a Superfund site, former uranium mill, not oil and gas, just south of Canyon City, and not yet fully assessed or cleaned up. So familiar with the hazards of low-level radioactivity. It has been a Superfund site for 41 years. They never got to it.
Yeah, and this, it's I mean, yeah, no one should have to live near such a place. A problem with why these things can take so long. I mean, some contaminants are very bad, but break down in the sun relatively quickly, and then they're gone. Other contaminants like radium or uranium, they have very, very long half-lives. So, as one scientist quoted in the book explains, and she's referring to a certain type of waste landfill, these sites will be radioactive until the sun burns out. So well past 41 years, and that's because it takes these elements so long to stop being dangerous. And they've been accumulated now in these places. but it's, you know, the Superfund program is at least one that has some funds, and hopefully, you know, EPA will continue to take those types of places seriously. But it also shows you the very long arc of contamination. So that site I showed you where the kids were partying, I mean, that's due to become a Superfund site. But goodness, just like in this community, they're going to be fighting for decades over that. And, you know, meanwhile, what happened to the kids who spent the whole summer covered in this stuff?
Yeah, yeah. Well, unfortunately, our discussion with Justin needs to end for now, but Justin's book, Petroleum 238, is available at bookstores for a more in-depth dive into the subject. After reading Justin's book, we realized the need for engaging the public regarding this information. And we believe that being an enlightened citizen can lead to positive changes. Do you have anything to add, Justin?
And that's a wonderful statement to end it on, Amy. I do believe that. And, you know, I know it seems dark out there sometimes, but without enlightened citizens, I mean, there would be no world left. They would have smashed it all to pieces long ago. So keep up the fight. Absolutely. It's why we still have a place to breathe and live.
Well,
Thank
thank
you.
you for all that you do. The League of Women Voters of Colorado wishes to thank you, Justin, for sharing with all of us much of the significant content of your investigation tonight. Many thanks to all of our attendees for your interest, questions, and attendance. We also wish to thank Barbara Dungy for providing the technical support, and Jane Dunk, who was at the beginning. They both helped us with anything that we needed. So we wish to thank all of you. Have a good evening. You can stop recording.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you, everyone. That was really wonderful.